Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. Your Excellencies, respected guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor and pleasure to have you here tonight in this lecture within the series of Al-Furqan London lectures on Islamic heritage. Like the previous lectures that we had, this lecture comes within Al-Furqan continuous efforts in shedding light into the cumulative efforts of people from different races, religions, cultures, ethnicities and backgrounds in building the common human civilization for the betterment of the humankind, emphasizing the fact that, as Professor Diana put it in her book, everything is a continuum and that nothing just appears out of a vacuum. It also comes within the framework of the public lectures that Al-Furqan is organizing with the aim to highlight key international days that are related to the scope and work of Al-Furqan. This lecture coincides with the International Day for Monuments and Sites that happened or was highlighted a couple of weeks ago now, but due to the engagement of the professor, we couldn't do it at that time, so it comes a bit later. Which is celebrated usually on the 18th of April every year. Before I give the floor to our keynote speaker tonight, I would like to invite our chairman, Mr. Sharaf Ahmed Zaki Yamani, to welcome you and to say a few words. Please, Sharaf.
Thank you, Sali. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Esteemed guests and friends of the Foundation, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's lecture on behalf of the Al-Furqan Islamic Heritage Foundation and on behalf of the Yamani Cultural and Charitable Trust. We are honored to have with us Al-Ustada Al-Jalila Diana Darke, a renowned author, scholar and expert in Islamic culture, heritage and architecture. I thank you for joining us. I have been eagerly awaiting your lecture, and I'm sure I will be fully informed and enlightened by the end of it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, the field of architecture has always been a critical element of human civilization, representing human creativity, ingenuity, reflecting cultural values and beliefs. From the pyramids of Giza to Athens' Parthenon and Rome's Colosseum to modern skyscrapers and public spaces, architecture has played a vital role in shaping communities, defining their identities, and providing a sense of place and belonging. Islamic architecture in particular is known for the use of geometric patterns, intricate calligraphies, ornate motifs, all of which are visually pleasing and harmonious. The play of light and shadow combined with the use of water and the careful arrangements of courtyards and gardens adds depth and dimension to Islamic architecture, capturing the essence of Islamic culture and spirituality. Tonight, we might conclude that the undeniable influence of Islamic architecture on Europe is a testament to the rich cultural exchange in the past. In tonight's lecture, our esteemed speaker will explore fascinating examples of Islamic design elements shaping stunning European monuments and buildings. Here in the Foundation, we believe that appreciating these architectural influences is essential for defining and preserving a society's identity. By understanding the interwoven threads of various design styles, we can celebrate the unique fusion that has contributed to the vibrant tapestry of our shared cultural legacy. As an inspiration, for example, I draw your attention to the famous 14th century Egyptian historian Al-Maqrizi, the second edition of the 7-volume a critical edition of his book المواعظ والاعتبار في ذكر الخطط والآثار, was published now 10 years ago by the foundation. Now, Al-Maqrizi's work focuses on the Islamic period in Egypt, especially in Cairo and its architecture during the Fatimid, Ayyubid and Mamluk period. He occasionally refers to earlier periods, acknowledging Egypt's rich history, including the Pharaonic and Greco-Roman past. He even discusses ancient ruins or monuments and how they were repurposed or incorporated into later Islamic structures and styles, including the use of materials from ancient Egyptian temples and other structures to construct some Islamic buildings. I end by saying, as Islamic architecture drew inspiration from the ancient monuments and styles before them, it has indeed had a measurable influence on the Western architectural marvels we see today. And the cycle continues, and tonight our esteemed speaker will put on her Al-Maqrizi lens and tell us all about our shared heritage. On behalf of the Al-Furqan Islamic Heritage Foundation, I thank you again for joining us tonight, and I invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy the lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharaf. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, although Al-Furqan's main study focus is on the Islamic written heritage, from time to time we do initiate projects and events that deal with the tangible heritage, i.e. the physical places and objects. For both of these types of heritage fall within the so-called cultural heritage, and are linked organically with each other, of course, since they both contribute in building the human civilization. In theory, civilization is bigger unit than the culture. As it is known, culture is just a speck or a portion of an entire civilization. Each civilization can contain not only one but several cultures. Furthermore, the civilization is not simply a technological advancement, but a wider complex, including culture, norms, morality, etc. Throughout the human history, there has been a continuous cultural interdependency in the process of building the human civilization, including the shared human civilization that we see today. Much of inventions and contributions has roots in other culture. As one of the well-known scholars during the Islamic heritage put it, Ahmed ibn al-Dalji says, no society can succeed if there is no cooperation even in doing a loaf of bread, let alone bigger artworks and other achievements. Hence, we can easily conclude that today's civilization is a result of the cultural interdependency and an outcome of the contribution of different people and cultures. Within these lines comes the importance of tonight's lecture entitled How Islamic Architecture Shaped Europe, where our keynote speaker, Professor Diana Darke, will document the many instances of artistic interaction between the Muslim and Christian world. This talk will take us on a visual journey through the key buildings both in Europe and the Middle East to show how our cultures have interacted and intertwined in ways that challenges all kinds of assumptions and stereotypes that we might make about our history. Before I give the floor to our keynote speaker, just a brief overview about her biography and achievements. Professor Diana Darke is a Middle East cultural expert with a specific focus on Syria, with degrees in Arabic from Oxford University and in Islamic art and architecture from SOAS, London. She has spent over 35 years specializing in the region, working for both government and commercial sectors. Among her publications are the highly acclaimed My House in Damascus, an inside view of the Syrian crisis, published in 2016, The Merchant of Syria, published in 2018, The Last Sanctuary in Aleppo, published in 2019, and her book, which sort of we celebrate tonight, and her main topic will be around that, Stealing from the Saracens, How Islamic Architecture Shaped Europe, published in 2020. This book, this very book, received 3 Book of the Year 2020 awards. Her most recent book, The Ottoman, A Cultural Legacy, was published in UK in September 2022, one of her last books, and she just gave us the good news of a new book that is coming soon, and we look forward to it. She's frequently invited to speak at international events and media, such as the BBC, PBS, TRT, Al Jazeera, and France 24. Her work on Syria has been published by the BBC website, the Sunday Times, the Guardian, and the Financial Times. She is a non-resident scholar at Washington's think tank, the Middle East Institute. Without further ado, it's my great honor and pleasure to invite her to the floor and to address this distinguished audience. Thank you so much, Professor, for being with us tonight, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for such a warm welcome, and I've been very touched, actually, by some of the comments that a few of you have made about the effect that this book has had on you, which is precisely what I was hoping for when I wrote it. The book is a visual journey. I mean, the whole process of putting it together was like a huge piece of detective work, and I should start by explaining the title, because it's been quite controversial. People have misunderstood it and accused me of all sorts of things, which I've done my best to refute. So, Stealing from the Saracens. So I should begin by explaining the word Saracens. The reason the word Saracens has to be in the title is because Christopher Wren, the great architect of St. Paul's Cathedral, probably the most famous British architect, said at the end of his life in his writings that he had used Saracen vaulting in the dome of St. Paul's. So this is kind of the starting point, and it explains why the cover of the book shows the interior of the dome of St. Paul's. And the whole concept, stealing from the Saracens, is a deliberate play on words, a kind of double irony, because one of the derivations of the word Saracens, which was the common way that Arab Muslims were referred to right up until about the 18th century, it was just the word Arab as such is never used in Western sources. It's always the Saracens, from the Latin as well. But the derivation, one of the derivations that I personally feel is probably the most accurate, is based on the Arabic word saraka, to steal. And so sarikin are people who steal. So I'm saying, isn't it crazy that we are stealing from people we call thieves? That's the double irony of it. It's meant to be amusing, but a lot of people have taken it as a sort of, how dare you say that that we're stealing? You know, that we in Europe should steal things. So this I hope sets it in some kind of perspective. So Christopher Wren himself, it is worth spending just a moment or two on this remarkable man, because he was a visionary. He was a very, very open-minded man. He said very early, he was one of the first people to observe that, and the way he phrased it was, what we call the Gothic style should rightly be called the Saracen style. And he explains why, and he points to various buildings in Europe that he calls Saracen buildings, like St. Mark's in Venice, for example. And the thing I discovered during my researches, which I hadn't known before, is how influenced he could have been by a lot of Arabic translations, because the time he was at Oxford happened to coincide, through pure good fortune, with the time when the Laudian Professorship of Arabic, the very first Professorship of Arabic, was set up. by Archbishop Laud, who gave the instruction that all travellers to the Eastern Mediterranean should bring back Arabic manuscripts for translation. And so scholars this was the very, very beginning of Arabic scholarship in this country. And Wren was a beneficiary. So a lot of these scientific texts which had been lost, that had existed in Greek before but had been lost, were rediscovered, and the first translations came across. And because Wren himself was a mathematician, remember, there was no such thing as the profession of architect in those days. His actual title, once he was a professor of mathematics first and foremost. But then, as he started to move into the architectural field, his title was actually Royal Surveyor, Surveyor of the Royal Works. There was no such concept as an architect, even then, in the early 17th century. So he really was such an open-minded man, although he never travelled beyond Paris, by all accounts. What he did was he asked anyone who was travelling to places like Constantinople or Egypt or anywhere in the Eastern Mediterranean to bring back drawings for him of buildings, and he would send questions out. When you go there, ask how they attach lead to the domes, to their domes. All these, he was constantly curious, always looking for new ways of doing things. He was a natural experimenter, and he was so open-minded to everything. So he really, I call him the arch synthesizer. He took material from wherever he found it and whatever was the best. And he said that he used Saracen vaulting in the Dome of St. Paul's because it was the best. Those are his words. So that in itself, people conveniently forgot all about that for a few centuries. It was, and then we have the whole thing of Gothic architecture. We have to realize that, that this whole concept of Gothic is something of a misnomer, to be frank. I mean, it was a term that was coined in the 1500s by an Italian art historian, Vasari. He coined the term Renaissance. All of these things are sort of modern inventions, if you like. And the term Gothic, when you read European art history books, the person who's credited with this, and the first building that's always cited as a Gothic building, is the Basilica of Saint-Denis in Paris. And the characteristics that it was meant to have are pointed arches, which are stronger structurally, and means that the walls can go higher, that you can have stained glass windows, and the vaulting of the ceiling. These are sort of key characteristics. And so the person who was in charge of building the Saint-Denis Basilica was the abbot Suger, who was an extremely important and influential man. He actually even acted as the regent of France when the King of France was off on crusade. And it was at the end of his life that he entered into this building program. And all we know from the sources is what the Christian sources say. The actual record is basically written by the monks who were working with him. And so, of course, everything is totally, he gets all the credit for everything. Abbot Suger, this is him in his own stained glass window in Saint-Denis. So he appears twice. He puts himself there twice, and he puts his name underneath to make sure that everybody knows exactly who he is, to make sure of his immortality. He takes all the credit everywhere in the inscriptions, and the actual people who built the basilica are completely unknown. There is no mention of them at all. And this is something which I feel is very significant. So the stained glass, I want to explain, while we're looking at stained glass, how important the Eastern Mediterranean and specifically Syria was for glass. Syria was the world leader in glass at this time, had been for centuries. Abbasid glass from in Raqqa, for example, they had the perfect materials there from the Euphrates and the pebbles of the Euphrates and the special plant called ushnan, which grew in the desert around there, which made the perfect sort of potash-like substance, which gave the glass this amazing luster and ability to be moulded. So craftsmen loved working with it. And when Crusaders first reached the Holy Land and established their kingdoms there in Antioch, one of the first things they realized was the sheer quality of the glass. And so again, it is recorded how shiploads of Syrian glass was brought into Europe and used in medieval cathedrals. And now that we have scientific analysis of glass that can be done, research has taken place which has established what they call the Islamic composition of the glass, which is to do with this ushnan, this particular plant. And it was so special, it gave this extraordinary luster and sort of magic and depth to the colour and the way the light passed through it, completely different to some modern piece of glass, which just comes straight through without any kind of complexity at all. These are very, very organic materials. And so when the Syrians lost their dominance of the glass industry in 1401, when Tamerlane came to Damascus and destroyed it and ran off with all the craftsmen, at that point Venice became the leaders because they were already trading with Syria. They were beginning to learn the techniques, and they took the monopoly of the glass trade onto Murano Island and kept it very secret. But even in Venetian recipes, they talk about the best kind of glass is made with the cinders of Syria. So it's again this reference to the superb quality of Syrian glass. And if you want to see an example of this, you only have to go up the road to the V&A, and on the right there is what's called the Luck of Edenhall. It's a goblet which is brought back from Syria. It's one of the prized possessions of the museum, and when you get up really close to it, you can see the wonderful bubbles inside. This is what gives it this sort of organic strength, which is so astonishing. The quality of it, the depth of it is unlike anything that can be produced today. And on the left there is also one of the exhibits in the V&A of the early stained glass. They have a superb collection of early stained glass in the V&A. And the glass techniques of enameling is something else that was taken from the Islamic world and brought into the later stained glass across Europe. And this enameling technique again originated in Syria, and it was under the Mamluks, and both the Egyptians and the Syrians became masters of this technique. And so it came across into Europe, and it transformed the way stained glass windows were made, because suddenly, instead of having to put together these very elaborate jigsaws of uneven shapes, you could have a whole window like a sort of artist's canvas that you could then draw an entire picture on, that was then just divided with these bars, rectangular bars, cut into so you can immediately see the later enamelled glass. So this particular stained glass window is of Jonah and the Whale, which is actually inside the chapel of Wadham College, which is where Wren himself was. So Wren would have seen this Syrian glass. I rather like the idea of him sitting in the chapel looking at what he didn't realise was a piece of Syrian artistic design and technology. So the spark that led to this book, because I never dreamt, in all honesty, that I would ever write a book about architecture. I hadn't realised how deeply this was actually embedded in me from probably quite an early age. But the whole thing that started it off was the fire at Notre Dame in April of 2019. When I saw the reaction of the world to this disaster, and this sort of cry that went up in France, our national heritage, our identity is going up in flames, it sort of made me startled, and I thought, why are they saying that? Don't they realise that pretty much every element of that Gothic cathedral wasn't from France? It all came from much further east. I mean, I had known that for a long time, and I had assumed that other people knew it as well, but clearly somehow or other that knowledge had got lost along the way. So that's what I felt compelled to sort of write the book, if you like, to point out to a general audience where all these features of Gothic architecture had come from. Because like Wren, I agreed with Wren, essentially, that what we call the Gothic style should rightly be called the Saracen style. And on the right here is Saint-Denis, Saint Denis, the patron saint of France. This decapitated saint, holding his own head. He is the martyr, Roman soldier who was killed by Roman soldiers. He was in France, and this statue of him is actually on the western facade of Notre Dame itself. But, and this is again something I discovered in the researches that I really wasn't expecting to find, was how in medieval times there was an awful lot of confusion of identities, because they didn't have any. They had obviously had no such thing as the internet or any source of impartial knowledge. I mean, the population was essentially illiterate, and so only a sort of elite of the clergy were able to read and were able to then tell people about history. And it turns out that Abbot Suger, the person credited with the beginning of Gothic architecture, had been very influenced by a book called Celestial Hierarchies, which is all about the philosophy of light. And it was written by, as he understood it, by a disciple of St. Paul called Denis. And so, accept that. So all throughout the Middle Ages, the person who wrote this very influential book, which is the philosophy behind Gothic architecture, letting in the light, was thought to have been this disciple of St. Paul. However, subsequent scholarship discovered that this was a fraud, essentially. So he ended up being called Pseudo-Denis, because it turned out that the person who wrote this very influential text, the Celestial Hierarchy, was in fact a 5th century Syrian monk who has nothing to do with Saint-Denis, nothing to do with the patron saint of France. So the whole thing is built on a complete muddle of identities, a sort of medieval muddle, of which there were really quite a few, but people didn't have any access to to better information. So it was just taken for granted that this was the case. So Syrian Pseudo-Denis, as he was known, takes us to Syria. And this is really where we have the beginnings of Christian architecture, the earliest Christian architecture. The first actual building that is known to have been a church was actually just a house in Dura Europos on the Euphrates in Syria in I think it was 303. Because, of course, in the early centuries, Christianity was being persecuted. It was not official at all, so no Christian architecture could declare itself. So it was only after Constantine adopted it as the official religion of the Roman Empire, that Christian architecture as such could come out of the closet, if you like, and start to create churches, actual churches. And in Syria, we have the most extraordinary collection in the world. Again, very, very little known about, largely ignored, only became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2011, after the war in Syria had actually begun. I mean, shocking timing. But there, in what is actually today the province of Idlib, so this area is under opposition, rebel control, whatever you want to call it. So it's this very rebellious part of Syria, a little bit west and south of Aleppo, in the limestone hills, and there you have this concentration of 700 to 800 cities. They're known as the dead cities or the forgotten cities, in which there are over 2,000 early churches and the most astonishing treasure trove of early Christian architecture, which many people know nothing about. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to visit it many times, so I'm very familiar with it. These are churches from the 4th, 5th and 6th century, and they show you in great detail the earliest architecture. So one of these churches, called Kalblause, the Heart of the Almond, shows the first twin towers flanking a monumental entrance, and this dates to 460. And it is built in this way to receive pilgrims. The idea of the twin towers with a monumental entrance is to receive pilgrims because they are travelling on their way to the shrine of St. Simeon's. St. Simeon's Basilica was the Santiago de Compostela of its day. It was the most important pilgrimage route in Christendom. This is 50 years before the Hagia Sophia was built in Constantinople. And this is just a little bit west and north of Aleppo. So again, it's been in conflict zones, and it's a remarkable building, a centralized octagonal building with many unusual architectural features, and stained glass was actually found in some of the excavations there. Sadly, it has been quite badly damaged in the war. A Russian airstrike hit the column because it's named St. Simeon after St. Simeon Stylites, St. Simeon on his column, because he preached from his column, and crowds would come from all over the place. And so when he died, what was left of the pillar was still there, chipped away at by pilgrims over the years. So it became a stump, but even that stump was blown to smithereens by a Russian airstrike, and it's not visitable at the moment. It's in a part of Syria that can't be visited. But what you see in these incredible dead cities is an astonishing level of stonemasonry, because Syria, this whole area is a limestone massif. This is the building material that Syrians have grown up with, and so stonemasonry of this quality is basically as old as the hills, quite literally. And these capitals on the columns here are acanthus leaves blowing in the wind. So even then, and this dates from 490, they knew how to give this kind of movement of it blowing in the wind at this very, very early stage. So the fame of St. Simeon, as I said, was huge across Europe. So he appears in France. On the left there he is in a stained glass window on his column. In a village named St. Simeon after him. There are 2 villages in France named St. Simeon after him, and all sorts of memorabilia of St. Simeon have been found across France, things that pilgrims brought back. So his fame was absolutely legendary. And on the right-hand side, we have St. Simeon again in a mosaic that is inside St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. So he's a very prominent and key figure. So that is the base, if you like, upon which Islamic architecture had to build. So when the first Islamic dynasty of the Umayyads came and made its capital at Damascus, what they had to build on was all this pre-existing Byzantine Christian elements, which plus the Hellenistic background as well, which they absorbed essentially. So all of this they absorbed. And so the very first building that the Umayyads built, so the first statement, if you like, political statement building after they'd been in power for about 50 years, was the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. And so, again, a sort of European art historian would look at that and say, well, it's just a Byzantine church, isn't it? It's a Byzantine shrine. And on one level, you could say that it's just an octagonal, centralized building with a dome, like St. Simeon's Basilica had been. But there are very different things here, which I'd like to point out to you. So for a start, there's the obvious thing that all this decoration is on the outside, whereas on a Byzantine church, all the mosaics are on the inside. The outside is always actually very plain. So this is in itself a statement that all this decoration is on the outside, plus there's an inscription that runs all the way around there, which is admonishing Christians for believing in the three gods, in the Trinity. And so that's on the outside. And then on the inside are two very important innovations which do not appear in the Byzantine architecture which they inherited, which are new elements. And so first we have the beginnings of a pointed arch here in the colonnade around the ground level here, so that we have two round semicircular arches flanked by two pointed arches here. And then beneath the dome you have a row of trefoil arches, as they're called, these little triple arches. And that is the first time that they appear. And of course, these are tremendously important because they are covering all Gothic architecture, pointed arches and trefoil arches, as we will see. So Jerusalem, the extraordinary thing about Jerusalem is, again, all this sort of misinformation, if you like, that came out about it, that was perpetuated by things like this map. So this map was produced in the 1500s by a pilgrim who travelled accompanying his master. I think he was the Bishop of Mainz or something. But they spent months in Jerusalem, and he produced this map, which was the first printed pictorial map of Jerusalem anywhere. So it was hugely influential. It was translated and put into all languages all across Europe. And dead in the centre, we have the Dome of the Rock, an Islamic shrine. And yet this is the Christian presentation of Jerusalem. And the reason for this is because when the Crusaders came, they mistook the Dome of the Rock for the Temple of Solomon, and they marked it as such on all their maps. They put on their coins the Temple of Solomon, and they made it their headquarters. The Templars made it their headquarters, and Al-Aqsa Mosque beside it, they took as their palace, and this became their main centre, if you like, in Jerusalem, which is why it then became imitated all across Europe. We have churches modelled on this. We even have one in London here at Temple Tube Station. Temple. You go there. It's a round church modelled on the Dome of the Rock. So you have this extraordinary situation where the central monument in a Christian map is in fact an Islamic shrine, but all because of misunderstandings of what the building actually was. And the script, I should just mention, the script around it. The Crusaders actually thought that this script was holy writing because they thought it was the language of Jesus. And so, again, this is one of the reasons why Islamic script gets copied on things like textiles of bishops and things, which then start to appear in Europe, because it was being copied because they thought it was holy writing, and it starts to appear on various cathedrals as well. Again, it's just all based on complete misinformation and misunderstanding of what it really was. And so here we have another feature that is very important in Gothic. This is on the left-hand side here. This is the very first rose window. which comes from the Umayyad palace of Khirbat al-Mafjar, which is in today's Jericho, very close to Jericho on the occupied West Bank. You can visit that at the moment, so it's well worth a visit, in fact, if you do get a chance. And it's been reconstructed, and they found again coloured stained glass beneath it, which shows that the position of it was high up in the audience chamber of the palace. So its function was clearly as a decorative window and an important place to let ornamental light come through. So this is, if you like, the prototype of the rose window, which then takes 7 centuries to develop to the absolute peak of Gothic rose window in Chartres Cathedral. So the Umayyads, this is now, some of you will recognize it from Damascus. This is the entrance to Damascus National Museum, which is in fact the reconstruction of the entrance to an Umayyad palace, which was in the desert west of Damascus. And again, you have the twin towers flanking a monumental entrance, except now the towers are round, and all the elements are there in so many ways. You have these sort of these arcades, arches running round, and very, very detailed carving, which is very typical of Umayyad sculpture. And here you have a much better preserved example, which you can see in Berlin. If you go to the Islamic Museum in Berlin, which is part of the Pergamon Museum, you will see, you can get really up close to this, the facade of the Mashata Palace, an Umayyad palace, which was originally in what is today Jordan, but the Ottoman Sultan gave it as a gift to the Kaiser for German help in building the Hijaz Railway. So that's why it's ended up in Berlin. But you can see this incredibly detailed carving, where it's kind of bursting with nature, this sort of sense of organic energy, which is very typical of early Umayyad carving. This sort of, and the sheer skill of this as well, when you think how early this is in the 8th century. And again, it's always nature and animals interwoven, but this massive sense of bursting with energy. And Damascus, the Umayyad Mosque itself, very, very important monument. And again, you've only got to look at that from the outside to see how blended it is. So it's taken all the elements of what was there before. So you have the minaret here, which is actually called the Jesus minaret, because the local tradition has it that on the day of final judgment, Christ will descend from this minaret. It's very typical of the sort of blending of Christian and Muslim traditions in Damascus, which is still to this day a city where church bells ring out and blend with the call to prayer in a quite remarkable way. That was normal, of course, in cities like this. So you have the dome there, the Byzantine type dome, and you have the Hellenistic type pediment there, gable of temples that they would have seen in building in sites, Hellenistic sites and Roman sites like Palmyra, that were pre-existing, that they would have seen. So again, this is the inside of the courtyard of the Umayyad Mosque, and I'm showing you this because this is one of the very earliest examples of Islamic art. In that sense, it's Byzantine craftsmen, because they were incredibly skilled with mosaic work, but working now for Muslim masters. So the subject matter is different. So it's a representation of a sort of vision of paradise with fantasized buildings and trees and gardens, and there's a river flowing through. And here in the center, you have 3 arches taken from the Trinity of the churches, which are all over Syria. So they absorb this idea of the triple window, and you've got the columns of the Hellenistic sites, again, recycled. So all of this is taken in and blended to make something new in the earliest Islamic art. That happens to be a bit of damage that happened in the war. A mortar shell landed on the facade there, because this is exterior courtyard, but it was fixed within weeks. No serious damage has taken place in the centre of Damascus at all, unlike Aleppo. And then this is another early Umayyad site of Anjar, which is in the Bekaa Valley in today's Lebanon, a trading city, an Umayyad trading city, where again we see the way of this sort of double arches, layers of arches one above the other, which is a very typical Umayyad trait. And this now takes us to Spain, because what happened at the end of the Umayyads in 750, the Abbasids wiped out the Umayyad dynasty, killed everybody, except for one prince, Abdurrahman, who escaped and made his way across North Africa into Spain. And he, as an Umayyad, created Syria in Spain, essentially. He brought, like any exile, what you do is you bring your native country into your new country, and you try to recreate, insofar as you can, your place of origin. And so he brought all the Umayyad styles he was familiar with from Damascus. He put out the word once he was established from his capital at Cordoba. He put out the word to Umayyad craftsmen, some of whom, of course, were still, had been displaced as well, and they came and joined him in Spain. And what he built here at the Cordoba Mesquita, as it's still known today, a sort of mosque, a cathedral, a very, very famous building, where again you've got these double layers, like in Anjar just now. You've got this very typical double pattern ablak, as it's known. Usually it's black and white, but here in Spain it's red and white, because the colours of Abdurrahman were red and white, the Caliphate of Cordoba. And what you have in this is this extraordinary sense in the Cordoba Mesquita, I'm sure some of you will have visited it, where you have a complete absence of hierarchy. You enter it and you don't know where the beginning and the end of the building is. It's so opposite to a cathedral, where you have a long nave. It's very obvious where the important people sit and where the important part is. It's a totally different sense of architecture. The way the space is created is totally different, in a way which is designed, in my view, in Islam, is that there is no intermediary between you and God. So you don't need a hierarchy in that sense. You do have the mihrab, obviously. This is just an overview of the Cordoba Mesquita to show you how it's modelled on the Damascus Umayyad Mosque. So you've got the same courtyard, similar dimensions. You've got the what was originally the minaret, and then it was extended by his sons off into the 10th century. So it grew. It started off as a sort of more that kind of shape, and then the extensions were added. But then, of course, at the Reconquista, Ferdinand and Isabella, in reconquering Spain and imposing the Catholic religion, actually were going to destroy it. But there was such an outcry from the local population that they decided they wouldn't destroy it. They would plonk a cathedral right in the middle of it instead, as their sort of political statement of appropriation. So that is what that is in the middle there. It's a quite astonishing thing when you go in and suddenly inside this sort of maze, this network of pillars and extraordinary building, you suddenly come across this cathedral, which is utterly different. But the mihrab of the Mesquita is still there. And of course, what have we got here? We've got trefoil arches all along the top in an arcade there. So trefoil arches, like in the Dome of the Rock, placed in the most important part of the mosque, and used as a sort of a signifier, and an horseshoe arch, which is also started in the Damascus Mosque in a very, very slight form and becomes more exaggerated here in Spain, and the inscriptions all around. And then all over the the Cordova Mesquita, the arches are developed for the first time. So you start to get cinquefoil arches with 5 arches. You get 7. They get called multifoil arches then. But of course, because it's now a cathedral, you get this slightly incongruous thing where you have crucifixes stuck in these arches. There are 40 chapels around the outside of the mosque now. It's a very sort of disjointing building, actually, as you go around it. It's a very curious thing, but you can't take away from the atmosphere of the mosque because it's in the architecture, so it still hits you very strongly when you go in there. And this style, which again you can see how influenced this is actually the Cordova synagogue, because the Jews at Cordova also adopted the Islamic architectural styles in exactly the same way, with multifoil arches, with these very detailed sort of filigree designs, like, you know, from the Umayyad styles. And when the Jews were pushed out of the Iberian Peninsula in the Reconquista, and rebuilt their synagogues elsewhere, they chose to continue building them in a sort of neo-Moorish style. So they liked the Islamic architecture so much that they used it themselves. So the new synagogue in Berlin, for example, is built in a Moorish style. So the exterior of the Cordova Mesquita is covered in arches. Every type of arch you could possibly imagine. I'm sure you know the proverb, the arch never sleeps. You know, every surface that could possibly be covered with some form of arch as a decorative. So you have these interlocking, intersecting arches, which of course make pointed arches along the way. These very slender columns. You've got horseshoe arches, and you've got the merlons along the top. These crenellated design, which is thought to have originated in Mesopotamia, sort of crenellations, if you like. They become later crenellations in European architecture. And here on the left, this is actually Durham Cathedral. Here in this country, this is the Galilee Chapel in Durham Cathedral, which is copying this style of interlocking arches along its wall there, exactly mimicking that style. But in the Cordova Mesquita itself, one of the most remarkable things, and in some ways the most important of all for Gothic architecture, is the vaulting. The dome that is in front of the mihrab. So here we've got that mihrab with its row of trefoil arches there. The dome, which is immediately above that, is one of the very earliest ribbed domes. There are the ribs. They are structural and ornamental at the same time. This is another unique Islamic feature, if you like, that you make the actual structural elements into something ornamental and beautiful as well. They're not purely functional. And this very, very early, we're talking 10th century here. This dome here was actually analysed for the first time in 2015 by a pair of Spanish structural engineers who got special permission to go into the Mesquita and do various measurements. And they wrote a report saying that they were absolutely astonished at what they found, at the sheer level of geometric complexity that this dome exhibited. It was a masterpiece, they said, of geometry, and it has never needed structural repair in its entire existence since it was first built in its 1,000 years. And at the back of the Cordova Mesquita, there is a wall that displays all the masons' marks, the people who were involved in making it, and these were discovered during a renovation project. And when you look at the names of them all, the overwhelming majority are Arabic names in Arabic script. Just a handful are Christian, but so you can see from this that the overwhelming majority of the masons who built the Mesquita were Muslims. And this is what began as the minaret and has now become the bell tower of the cathedral, of the minaret. So then we come to the pointed arch. The story of how the pointed arch came into Europe. I call these things the gateways into Europe, by the way, in the chapters about this, and each gateway is analysed separately. So one of the earliest gateways actually is from Amalfi. So around the year 1000, the Amalfi merchants were trading with Cairo and Alexandria in particular. And the merchants saw the Ibn Tulun Mosque, which had pointed arches, and they liked the design very much and decided they wanted to bring that back and use it in their cathedral. And so the materials and some of the craftsmen were sent over, and Amalfi Cathedral uses the patterned, the black and white patterned ablaq and has the pointed arches here. And then an abbot, a Benedictine abbot from Monte Cassino, came to Amalfi to do trading, just because it obviously had rich textiles and many lavish things that were very good for gifts for high level nobility and royalty in Europe. So the abbot, the very important abbot Desiderius from Monte Cassino, came to Amalfi to look for a gift for the person who would become the Holy Roman Emperor. And he saw the design of Amalfi Cathedral and liked it and said, I would like that in my abbey in Monte Cassino. So the same thing happens. The craftsmen are sent over because, of course, the local craftsmen would not have a clue how to make a pointed arch like this. You can't just expect a local builder to just know how to do an entirely new style. It's just completely unrealistic. So the only way to get the job done properly is to bring in the people who were skilled at doing it, the people who were at the top of their game. And this is still in Amalfi. This is the Cloister of Paradise, as it's known, which is another example of very typical Islamic architecture, very slender columns with all the pointed interlocking arches, very typical style, which again comes into Gothic architecture more and more. And so with the borrowing of the pointed arch from Amalfi, at Monte Cassino, the Abbey of Cluny, Cluny is the headquarters of the Benedictines. This is the most powerful monastic order in the whole of Europe. They are astonishingly wealthy, very, very powerful. And the Abbot of Cluny sees it in Monte Cassino and says, I would like that in my new building, Cluny 3, as it's known. And so the same thing happens. And once Cluny has adopted the pointed arch, that is it. The fashion is set. The absolute top dog has got pointed arches. Every bishop in every cathedral city across Europe wants something similar. And so this is where suddenly you get this sprouting of Gothic cathedrals all over Europe, where the bishops start vying with each other to build something taller and taller, more and more impressive. And of course they then have to invent the flying buttresses to hold it up, because they become so high that some of them, of course, collapse. So we have Beauvais Cathedral, where it did collapse, and all we've got left is one section, which is all propped up by scaffolding today. But the Benedictines adopted these Islamic styles with incredible enthusiasm. So the pointed arch, and then, of course, because they were responsible for the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela, the biggest pilgrimage route of its day in Europe, they built along the route. So all the pilgrimage stops, they built Benedictine cathedrals all the way along the line, and they introduced all these Islamic styles. So we've got the coloured arches again here. There are Kufic inscriptions in Arabic tucked away. We've got the slender columns here. There are pointed arches in other parts of the cathedral. So we've got this whole network of Benedictine pilgrim stopping points, which are cathedral cities on the way to Santiago. So very, very powerful statement. So this is how it becomes part of the fabric of European Gothic architecture. And then we start to see in manuscripts in Europe, so this is from a French Bible, the frontispiece of a French Bible, showing God as architect of the universe, holding his set of compasses there, his dividers, and measuring out the earth. So this whole idea of the importance of geometry has now really entered the European sort of way of thinking in a way that it had not been there before. And this understanding and knowledge of geometry to create the vaulting systems, which are the ceilings in all the Gothic cathedrals, very clearly comes in from the Islamic world. And so we have here St. Mark's, obviously in Venice, which Christopher Wren points out is a very Saracen building. It uses, in its domes here, it has the Islamic model of domes, which are double domes, just like Christopher Wren used. Christopher Wren actually used a triple dome at St. Paul's, where the outer shell is different to the inner shell. So the outer shell projects more height and is lighter, and then the interior dome is a completely different dome inside, and there's a space in between them. And again, you've got all the features here of you've got all the crenellations, all the slender columns. I mean, the whole thing is all of Venice is essentially modelled on Islamic architecture. And one of the great scholars who I quote a lot in my chapter on Venice is a wonderful lady called Deborah Howard, who was the professor of architectural history at Cambridge. And she devoted 10 years of her life to writing a wonderful book called Venice and the East, where she explores in immense detail the trading links between Venice and Cairo and Alexandria in particular, and shows how modelled so many of the key buildings in Venice are on buildings in Cairo, especially. And so the Doge's palace, this incredibly, the Doge is the most important man in Venice. This is the sort of cathedral of commerce, if you like. And again, look at it. It's just rows and rows of pointed arches, arcades everywhere. The sort of two-tone of the facade there, the crenellations along the top. And what she shows in her work is that the exact dimensions of it are copied from the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So it's a deliberate statement again of that partly again based on the misunderstanding of what the Al-Aqsa Mosque was, that you copied it because it was holy, that it was something you modelled yourself on. So again, you've got all this. This is the Doge, detail of the Doge's palace here. This very, very delicate, elaborate work with the crenellations and the two-tone facade there. And then, of course, the Doge's palace in turn gets copied by many other buildings. And one of the most amusing ones I found actually is here on the right. This is a carpet factory in Glasgow, modelled on the Doge's palace. Because again, it's a cathedral of commerce. And so, they just adopt it wholesale. So this is still in Venice. So you've got here what's called the telephone dial motif, which is directly copied off a Mamluk palace in Cairo. Again, arches everywhere, pointed arches, these tall, minaret-like chimneys. So Venice is so Islamic. I mean, once you realise it, you'll just see it everywhere as you walk around the narrow streets. Even the feel of it is, the narrow streets, the way you have little dead end alleyways and little separate neighbourhoods. It's a very, very Arab feel. And then, of course, we have the case of Sicily. Sicily, tremendously important again. So here in Palermo, we have the Cappella Palatina, the royal chapel of Roger II, Norman king who becomes the king of Sicily. He adopts wholesale the pre-existing Arab Islamic culture, which is largely Fatimid influenced. And so you then have this incredible blended style where you have Byzantine mosaics with Fatimid arches here, and the Muqarnas ceiling, which is again, scholars generally accept now that Fatimid carpenters were brought in from Cairo to build this it was specially made for the ceiling. And again, the sheer blended skill of all of these, the levels of skill were such that nothing of this level. And again, it's a vaulting style. Mykonos is a vaulting style. The ceiling holds itself up there through the vaulting. So it's an incredibly advanced thing, the like of which has not been seen on European soil before. And then, of course, we have Islamic Spain a little bit later, after the caliphate itself had fallen, when you have Granada, the Nasrid kings there, with Alhambra, the very famous and influential Court of the Lions. Again, you've got the slender columns, the trefoil, multifoil arches all around. Very influential, and look at the detailing, the same kind of absolutely packed with energy of arabesques and nature bursting out with inscriptions and symbols of fertility everywhere. The whole thing is again sort of an echo of the early Umayyad, bursting with energy, sort of sense of organic life, nature just coming out from every surface. And this was tremendously influential, of course, in the neo-Gothic and the 19th century revival of Gothic, where people like William Morris, again, you can see it again here in all William Morris designs. It's that same thing of nature bursting out. He's taken all these ideas of the sheer abundance, and there isn't a single space anywhere. Everything is just full of energy and life. And these are patterns that we still see around us today, placemats, curtains, you name it, and bed sheets. We're still surrounded by all these designs. And then, of course, Neo-Gothic, we've got the Houses of Parliament, Big Ben, absolutely covered in pointed arches, trefoil arches, everywhere, absolutely covered in them. And this is, the heart of English, the British democracy. We have St Pancras Station, with, again, a sort of neo-Gothic fantasy, with or a sort of Moorish fantasy, really, all these styles copied and recreated here in a sort of absolute fantasy of arches everywhere. We have the Brighton Pavilion down in Sussex, again, a sort of Oriental fantasy, multifoil arches everywhere, the onion domes, the tall minaret-like chimneys, just like in Venice. So we have these much later buildings. In France, we've got Montmartre, which again has Islamic domes. On its own website, it actually says openly that it has taken inspiration from Islamic architecture in the design of the ceiling. And in Spain, on the left here, we've got Burgos Cathedral from the 14th century. Again, it's very, very detailed, elaborate, very typical, what Wren would have called Saracen pinnacles, all of this kind of detailing and sheer sort of life and bursting with energy everywhere. And then we have the modern day version of it in Barcelona, in Spain, in Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, which is the most astonishing example, really, of how religion, geometry, and nature have all been fused together in an incredible way. And Gaudi himself openly says that he was influenced by Islamic architecture. He has that same sense of wanting an organic structure that you enter and you feel the presence of God all around you through the light, through the colours, through the sensation of the space. And it is an astonishing example. I would call that, if you had to categorize that, you could call it Hispano-Saracenic or something like that. It's a completely remarkable thing, and of course it's still not finished. 100 years after Gaudi's death. It's meant to be being finished in 2026, and they're working on it. 200 craftsmen from all over the world are working on it non-stop, desperate, trying to finish it in time for the centenary of his death in 2026. So the Gothic, even the Neo-Gothic, crosses the Atlantic into America. So this is New York Cathedral, where you've got the Twin Towers, the monumental entrance, you've got the pointed arches, the rose window, trefoil arches, all of these characteristics in New York. And then Gothic architecture gets adopted wholesale by the university campuses in America. So this is Yale University, which is very Gothic. Got the Harkness Tower here on the left, and here is one of the main lending libraries in Yale, which looks for all the world like the nave of a Gothic cathedral. And then you've got the Capitol building itself in Washington, D.C., which uses an Islamic dome, just like St. Paul's. You've got the two different domes, the inner and the outer shell, in order to distribute the weight and to get a more imposing profile on the outside. So you can see how it's travelled all over the world. And one of the most endorsements, one of the best endorsements, the thing I felt really captured the book, actually. I was so pleased because this was before the book was published. I approached Rowan Williams, who himself was at Wadham. And I thought, well, he's an open-minded kind of a guy, even though he was Archbishop of Canterbury. He's another visionary, if you like, somebody who is open-minded, who's prepared to take the best from everywhere. And he immediately got it. He read the manuscript before it was published, and he completely understood what it was all about how cultures intertwine and interweave in all sorts of ways that you would not expect and which challenge our preconceptions. And so that's what I've tried to do in the book. Thank you.
Okay, we are running a bit late, but probably we'll try in 10-15 minutes to get some questions and hopefully, please, there's another mic.
Thank you so much. That was riveting. One personal question and then an academic question. What is your favourite arch?
My favourite arch?
Yes.
Barbara.
Don't worry if you can't answer it. I'll go on to the next one.
Well, I think probably the most impressive arch I've ever seen anywhere is pre-Islamic, actually. It's, and I'm never sure quite how you pronounce this, I think it's Ctesiphon in Iraq. Have you seen the pictures?
Yes.
The early pictures?
Yes.
And it is still standing,
Yes.
astonishingly. And it is a pointed arch.
Yes.
It's quite remarkable. And that must have been very influential, and clearly, that knowledge was there then. And so again, I mean, there's been influence from further east as well. You have to acknowledge that. There's no doubt.
Well, my favourite arch being the horseshoe arch. In your research, what is the earliest recording of the? This is not on. What is your earliest finding of evidence for a horseshoe arch? I mean, how far back can we go? Thank you.
Well, what I say in the book, and I mean, this is a controversial area. I don't think there's consensus on it by any means, but my own view and the view of architects in Damascus who I consulted on it, and in the book there is actually a picture of what they call the Damascus Arch. It's divided into fifths. I think it's called, they even call it al-mahmus or something, divided into 5. And it shows how it's made, and it's the very earliest. It's a very slight horseshoe arch, and you can see it in the Damascus Mosque, in the Damascus Umayyad Mosque. Not everywhere, but in some of the arches you can see it. And I have been round and found what you could say is definitely the very beginning of it. So that's my view. Of course, people in Spain are dead convinced that the Visigoths invented it, but I personally think that's not true at all, because a lot of the things where they point to it in northern Spain, in Visigothic churches, have actually been subsequently post-dated to the Islamic arrival in the Iberian Peninsula. So but of course, everybody wants to claim to be the first.
Sorry, I forgot to mention this. So usually just introduce yourself, please, for the sake of the video.
Thank you very much, Professor. My name is Mikhail. I am doing my MA in International Relations at King's College London, and currently I'm focusing on symbolism and diplomacy. And since architecture is also a significant aspect of symbolism, would you consider the disappearing of architectural understanding in certain types of regions, especially in the Middle East, did undermine the ontological self-security identity of the states with the disappearing of those architectures? So we can clearly see it in new modern architectures such as Turkey or Saudi Arabia doing embassies with insisting on cultural and traditional heritage. Would you see any relation to that disappearing of architecture and ontological identity?
When you say disappearing, you mean reappearance then in the case of new architecture.
Yes.
In places like Oman and particularly in the Gulf, actually, really, isn't it? I mean, where you see it being adopted pretty much, especially in government circles, government buildings, and of course the building of new mosques. That's certainly where I've noticed it most, and I think it is an attempt to reassert a kind of identity, because I think there was a loss of cultural identity for a period when there was a horrible drive, for instance. I mean, it was fairly general, but it certainly happened in Syria, and I'm sure it happened in other countries too, across the Middle East, where a kind of post Second World War sort of modernization drive, if you like, where everything had to be European, and so beautiful old centres of cities were bulldozed. I mean, there's a huge amount of damage caused in cities like Damascus and in Aleppo, where bulldozers just came in and ploughed through great big avenues, because the idea was, we have to have a really nice wide boulevard like they have in Paris, because that's modern, and that's and I think, that was very misguided, and it was very fought against by some people at the time. It was too late, unfortunately. I think a lot of that happened in the 1960s and 50s. So I think there's been a realization since then that was a great loss. And of course, once you've done it, you can never get it back. That's the other thing. Once you've destroyed an old building, you can never, ever recreate it. And that's another reason why it's so important to, if you do have an old building, never over-restore it. So with my own house in Damascus, for instance, which was a 3-year restoration project for me. I mean, that's when I became really deeply interested in Islamic architecture and went back into the academic world to go to SOAS and get my MA in Islamic art and architecture. So spending 3 years with a team of Syrian craftsmen and a Syrian architect really opened my eyes into the sheer levels of skill that these people had, and their connection to the building. And my architect really understood what I meant when I said, look, it's an old building. You expect it to have faults, damage and stuff. If you start covering up so say there's a bit of a hole somewhere, as there obviously there was, all sorts of things. The building has come through wars, fires, earthquakes, all sorts of evidence of damage. But my view was that this is part of the building. You do not cover that up and pretend that it never happened. You leave it there as a sort of, so that the building represents the history that it has lived through. And so that's a very different kind of thing to what happened obviously in the Gulf, where everything started from scratch, where you didn't have it in the first place, so you build it from nothing. It's a very, very different approach. And I did live for 3 years in Dubai, so I saw it up close, and pretty in your face. A lot of it was too, I must say. And nothing, not a patch on the real old buildings. You can never recreate that. The soul that an old building has. No new building, however beautiful, is ever going to match that.
Hello, Islam. My name is Zainab. I'm just here as an invitation. This is not. I'm just interested in this area. I'm not an academic in this area. I've got two kind of related questions. One is about the history. So the Muslim, Islamic early domes. I think I've read somewhere that when people like Sir Christopher Wren and the Europeans were trying to emulate or create their own domes, they did have to use innovation, because we still don't know and understand how those early domes were made. Have I understood that right? If you can correct me. And sort of the second part of the question is that my understanding is that stonemasons and masonry and Masonic guild was obviously very secretive, because they were using algebra and geometry and Arabic numerals, which didn't come in for a long time. And I just wonder why and their sort of secrecy and how they held on to that sort of helped develop the spread of the Islamic architecture in Europe. So, thank you.
That second question actually is funnily enough something I've been reading about just in recent weeks. So you're right that these things tended to stay within families, and so in Spain, for example, even after the Reconquista, when you had Christian rulers in charge, large numbers of Muslims stayed. And they dominated. They are recorded as dominating the construction industry. So under the Christian rulers asked for Muslim masons, because the master masons, because they were the best, And if you're the ruler, you want the best. You don't, it's the same. It's always been the same. You can pay. You can afford the best, so you get the best. And they were the best. That was the reason they dominated it, and they dominated it for so long, for centuries after the end of Muslim rule. This is just a testimony to how the level, the sophistication of their skill was on way superior to what Christian architects had. But what happened over the period of the development of guilds? What happened was, as the skills began slowly to pass over to Christian masons and carpenters and other craftsmen, the Christians started to create guilds which were religious. So they excluded Muslims, and so of course then it became exclusively Christian guilds, which again became very secretive and kept things to themselves. So this has been there is documentary evidence of this, which I've been reading about for the new book that I'm hoping to bring out in a couple of years' time, which is fascinating to see how that is all recorded, because it does show you how important the people are. The people who actually made these buildings, the whole story of those people, and how they pretty much everything in the Iberian Peninsula, the level of culture generally was way higher than anything in Europe. It was just better, music, literature, cuisine, architecture, the whole works. It was a more sophisticated culture, and Europe, emerging from its so-called Dark Ages, acknowledged that, and so, the Islamic culture was the gateway through which a lot of these things passed, and of course, then over time they do pass over fully, and then there's no longer, it becomes something which obviously, a Christian master mason will then go on, and it's quite striking to me that in the European sources, you only get the names of the architects or master masons, as they were, of these early Gothic cathedrals, once it's, lo and behold, a Norman. William of Sens is one of the first people who gets mentioned. And I just sort of look at his name and I think, well, fine, but where did he get that knowledge from? And there's silence, nothing, And so it's a very interesting sort of detective work to try to piece together what was going on in that period before.
And the early domes?
The domes. So remind me what the question was there.
Do we know how the early domes were made? Do we know how the early domes were made?
The early domes
Of the early Islamic domes?
the early Islamic domes.
The very earliest ones.
I thought we did, actually. I mean, I didn't think there was particular lack of knowledge on that. I mean, where there is a complete absence of record is the Gothic cathedrals. I mean, there are no plans, nothing is written down, and that in itself, to my mind, is quite revealing. That this is knowledge done from instinct, and you don't acquire that instinct, like some vision from, you don't. It takes generations and generations to develop this level of skill. And who had the skill at that time? Muslims, I mean, so it must have begun with them and then slowly passed over to, the other local people eventually. I mean, it took time. It takes a couple of centuries. I mean, things move very in the medieval world. Things moved extremely slowly in architectural terms. Nothing could suddenly be different unless it come from elsewhere, from a higher level of culture that had suddenly come in.
Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Nahid. I'm also like Zainab, I'm actually a doctor, and find your work and travelling to all these different parts of the world a form of mindfulness. It's fascinating, and it's been a wonderful highlight of my week, I think, sitting here listening to you. So thank you so much. What you've outlined is quite extraordinary in that you've taken us around Europe and across the Atlantic to the States, where many of us travel, the Ivy League universities. If you don't mind, could I ask it's probably a personal question. At the very beginning of your talk, you highlighted resistance or perhaps negative feedback. Would you mind just, if you wish to, commenting a bit more about that? In terms of, just given the content of this book, in the current climate that we're in, certainly in my lifetime, what sort of negative, if you don't mind discussing that, because I think it does reflect the steely nature of yourself and perhaps the publisher as well, to move ahead with this to a certain extent. So thank you.
Yeah, there has been criticism. I mean, in some ways, a bit less than I expected. I mean, I was prepared for much worse. But I think the reason the book sort of took off so much was because The Guardian, the architectural correspondent of The Guardian, by pure fluke, happened to be somebody who, as a student, had visited Syria, and he knew the dead cities. So when he saw the book, he came across his desk and he flipped through and he saw the pictures of the dead cities. It spoke to him, and he thought, good God, yes, everybody's forgotten about those. And so he kind of had some kind of link to it. So he got it straight away, like Rowan Williams. And so he did this double-page review of the book the week before it even came out. And thanks to that, the book sold out on the day it was published, because the amount of interest that was generated by that was phenomenal. So I think it got off to a very good start. That was luck, if you like, that it was picked up by something as big as that straight away. And this was still in the pandemic, of course, when it was published in when was it? August 2020. So I couldn't do any in-face talks, but I did loads of Zoom talks with all sorts of organisations who contacted me and wanted, And I did one in America for the Middle East Institute, where I'm a non-resident scholar. So I managed to get over to the American audience, which was great. They had 700 people subscribed, for that launch and things. So it made a big splash, and on the whole, people were very grateful for the fact that I pointed all this out, and they kind of, after I pointed it out, they could see it for themselves, and that's exactly what I always wanted, for people to see it with new eyes, to understand it better, to enrich their own appreciation of these buildings, which is what it's done for me. It's not to negate the achievements of Gothic cathedrals; it's to understand what's behind them, and the depth of everything that's represented there. But you always get some, and it has tended to happen more on Twitter than anywhere else, where you get people who savage you, basically. And once or twice I bothered to reply, but you can't. You get nowhere with people like that. So in the end, you just sort of block them and forget about it.
Okay, one last question. Please, just here.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really, really fascinating. Where is it?
Sorry. Yeah, this one. Just to keep it a bit closer.
Okay, yeah.
You can introduce yourself.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, my name is Asma. I'm an economist, as a lot of people. I don't know anything about architecture, so I'm really fascinated by your talk. I was just wondering, so this as I said, I don't know anything about this. So, is this the first book where this is how the story was said, and what was if so, what was the other story about this? How before your book or before this type of scholarship, what was the official mainstream story about architecture in Europe? Where did it come from?
Well, that's it. You see, that's the reason I wrote the book. As I said, it was the fire at Notre Dame which showed me that the perception, the European perception, this very Eurocentric view, was that everything was European, and that it was all the creation of Europe. And when you read standard books on by European art historians, they're all the same. They're all the same. There is absolutely no mention of any Islamic influence at all. And it's I just felt something. I had to sort of correct the narrative, if you like, because what I've found is that academics work away in their own little box, and they do their work, but they don't join the dots, with other things. And so from my point of view, it's brilliant, because they've done all the hard work. They've worked away at one particular little field, which is a stepping stone for me to find that, and then find another stepping stone, and to link up all these pictures into the whole. And it's kind of obvious, because the buildings themselves are the proof. You can see it there, and none of the stuff just pops out like some virgin birth, in the way that it's slightly the narrative of Notre Dame, that this miracle, sort of appeared. And nothing in architecture is like that. The Sagrada Familia has got such a backstory in terms of, Gaudi. There's a lot about Gaudi and his own backstory in the book. And I find him particularly fascinating as an architect, because he was a visionary. He took everything from wherever he found the best and most. He knew what he wanted to do, and he just, he was a creative being, and he didn't sort of think narrowly at all. He said he borrowed from everywhere simultaneously and synthesized it into something new. And I think that's what the best architects do.
Okay. Well, one last remark, please, just quickly.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to follow on what this lady was saying about the lack of understanding about the Islamic influence in Europe. And I think it's generally, we're starting to understand it now in the history of science. I'm a scientist, so I was interested in the alchemists and the what we've had in learning about European history is, for a long time, there was the Romans, the Greeks, the Latins, and then there was the Renaissance.
That's it. Yes.
And there was this this gap in the middle, and we're starting to get that backstory through the history of science and now the history of architecture as well and stuff. So I think it's that, where did the Renaissance come from? And if you look at that, then it comes from the Islam.
And I'm hopeful that actually, because it's all basically about the education system, and I myself am a product of that education system, where I was taught at school that Greece and Rome were the origin of all civilization, and that was that, really. No questions asked, and that's how I grew up. My mother's German, and so we travelled a lot in Europe when I was a child, and we went to Greece, and that was it. And then I switched to Arabic at university and went to the Arab world for the first time and saw an entirely different side of things. Then I realised that, what we think of as Greek, the Greek temple shape, isn't even Greek. They borrowed it from further east, from the Eurasians. and I then sort of, from quite an early age actually, began to understand all of this and suddenly start to see it very differently. But it is about the education system. And I'm hopeful that the education system will begin to change. And I've been told by a couple of people that the architecture syllabus that they teach, one university here down in Bath and then in Cairo, they've actually changed the syllabus to reflect this now as a result of some of the info. I mean, you've got to start somewhere. And my hope is that, this is the first book that I'm aware that's doing this, but it's very much just the initial overview. There's so much more. It's a huge field of research that I hope many other people will dig into more deeply, because there is so much to find still. Huge amount. I mean, I'm not going to be able to cover it in my lifetime, so I need other people to do it, because there is a huge amount still.
Wonderful, thank you.
Books like this, lectures like this, and that's exactly what Al-Furqan stands for as well. So what we are trying to do is bridge that gap that exists in the history of science through most of the work that Al-Furqan is doing. And not only that, but what we are trying to do is complete that mosaic of the human knowledge in general, and bridging and connecting different cultures, starting from the Chinese, the old Egyptian, and the Roman and the Greek, and obviously bridging the gap within the Islamic civilization and reaching all the way to the Renaissance. So please follow up our work, our lectures. We really wish to see you always part of our future activities. Okay, the good news is that this book is very rich, and the other good news is that the book is outside. So the publisher has been kind enough to offer a 50% discount. And on top of that, the cherry on the cake is that the author is here and she can sign the book for those who... The copies are limited, so it's first come, first serve. Don't rush though. I hope there will be enough for everyone, I hope. But at the end of this lecture, I hope everyone agrees with me. It was a fascinating journey. Thank you so much, Professor, for being with us tonight. May we book you from now publicly for the coming book in November. So there is even more fascinating book coming in November. She just told us before the 2024. Okay, well that's still not far. Okay. Thank you so much for all of you. Thank you to the professor. Thank you for being part of tonight's lecture. Thank you to the Al-Furqan team for putting everything together tonight. And we really hope to see you again in our future events. Have a good evening.